Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the Women's Prize shortlist for 2024. So we are now, we've recently had the shortlist. We're kind of gearing up towards a winner coming fairly soon, and I've finally managed to finish reading the shortlist. So let's get started talking about the books, and I'll go by the alphabetical order of the surnames of the authors. First up, we have Anne Enright with The Wren. And this is a book I absolutely adored. So this is a novel that really looks at the relationship between a mother and a daughter. And it's told in this very loving, very affectionate way, but also with this real kind of cutting humour that kind of permeates the whole book. I loved this. I thought it was really fun, really engaging, really well observed. She spends so much of the book really kind of analysing the kind of intricacies of a mother-daughter relationship. And particularly, I think in this book, really examining that through the lens of sort of the little ways that generations, and particularly parents and children, can sort of grow apart and not fully understand each other, and kind of the specifics of their situations. So, for example, you know, at one point the mother kind of saying, well, you know, of course things always work like this, isn't this how things go? And, you know, the daughter not quite understanding that from her side as well. I just think it's so well done. Anne Enright is so good at capturing the sort of intricacies of dialect and idiolect, and just the little ways that people talk to each other, the ways that dialogue is often, you know, sometimes in books, dialogue is presented as kind of character A says something and shares this information, and character B gets there. Anne Enright sometimes, I think, is very good at stripping it back so that you're almost not aware that you're reading a novel. There's something very natural about the dialogue between characters. And so sometimes, you know, not every bit of dialogue has to serve this big function of conveying information. Sometimes it's more about us reading between the lines of the what's not being said, what kinds of things are happening in this interaction. I think this is where Anne Enright is just exceptional, I think. And so I really loved this book. I just thought it was a lot of fun, whilst also just being a really deep and thoughtful book as well. Next up, we have Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshananthan. And this is a book that I just thought was really beautiful and really interesting in many ways. It's particularly focused on the Sri Lankan Civil War, and really kind of goes into the sort of sweeping epic almost of people's lives. We're introduced to a few characters quite early on who are fairly pivotal to the whole thing, including a young man who's known as Kay, and he we sort of see is sort of caught in between various sort of things. He's a sort of political figure. He goes to join a political party and is, you know, very much seen as having this important role, but equally other people around him are kind of caught in the crossfire of this. Not only the sort of the actual crossfire of the conflict and of the Civil War, but also various other complicated things around that. He, you know, I think what this book does very well is everybody in this argument and in this civil war thinks that their side is correct and is doing things that are both humane and inhumane in some capacity. And so our main character, working as a trainee nurse, sees the sort of the both sides of that. She sees these moments of tenderness where a soldier comes in and just needs some care and attention and some love, but she also sees the brutality of what has happened to lead into that. And she's very much caught in the middle of this sort of character who works like a dog, basically, like works herself absolutely to the bone to be able to make sure that people are looked after. And in some ways, I think through that sheds light on the people who are often forgotten in stories of conflict, who are the people, the kind of basically the first responders, the people who are there trying to keep the universe together in some way. And I think this book is really beautiful in the way that it is able to capture that. I found myself really following along with the story of these characters, and particularly our sort of central character, who's just so almost set upon at times with the kind of various bits of tension she's got internally, and the kinds of ways that she is seeing her own political consciousness rising within her, but also it's sort of caught all in the midst of something far more complicated and difficult to stomach. Next up, we have Kate Grenville with Restless, Dolly, Maunder. And this is a book that is interesting in a few ways, focusing on a character in sort of rural Australia. And we later find out, right at the end of this book, the kind of personal connection to the author. So the kind of epilogue or sort of acknowledgements part of the book talks about how Dolly Maunder was a real-life woman, and is related to Kate Grenville. She's sort of part of the family. And so in some ways, this book is a sort of a fictionalized biography of Dolly Maunder, of kind of trying to piece together who this woman was based on the sort of historical records that remain of hers and family stories and what's been passed down and all those sorts of things. You know, Kate Grenville never herself knew Dolly Maunder, but there's this family history, and so she's trying to piece that together. And at the same time, it's, you know, as well as being a fictionalized biography, it's also sort of a biographical novel. And although those sound like they should be the same thing, there is I think a slight difference. And so at times it is also a novel based on a real person. And for me, I slightly struggled with the book partly on that. A lot of it I thought was really interesting. I thought there was a lot that was really great about the ways that it particularly looks at the various ways that women were held back, and the ways that women, particularly in certain time periods, the 19th century and sort of 20th century in this book, the ways that this woman had to be this kind of almost outlandish figure to be able to survive and to be able to do what she wanted. You have to kind of almost go so much bolder because you have to resist all these rules placed upon you. I think my difficulty with the book was that I felt like the kind of, if it had just been a novel or just been a sort of a biography, I think it would have felt a little cleaner and easier to write this story. Whereas sometimes I felt personally that things were held back because there was sort of almost, we can't go for these bombastic plots that would maybe be a bit more dramatic and a bit more exciting, because that didn't happen to Dolly Maunder. But equally, we're sort of, there's a kind of fictionalized jazzy element kind of going on top of a biography, and so for me that didn't always connect, and so sometimes I felt like parts of this book were sort of telling the audience what had happened, and sort of this thing happened and then after this thing happened, and didn't always necessarily connect to me, because I think I don't know, something, I just felt slightly at arm's length with this novel. Don't get me wrong, I've seen other people have really enjoyed it. I think it's very much a personal thing. But yeah, didn't necessarily work for me. I still don't think it's a bad novel. I think it just wasn't one that worked for me. Next up, we have Isabella Hammad with Enter Ghost. I did a separate review on this. I adored this. I thought this was very, very clever. The core idea of it is a Shakespeare play being put on in the West Bank, and the whole idea of, as this Hamlet production is building up and they're kind of gearing up to it, we see the political tensions all around it. So we see, for example, that this is fraught with tension, but also the resonance that kind of comes up through the language in the book. So because of the political situation, in some ways, Hamlet is given extra poignancy. We sort of see how Shakespearean language about resisting power or speaking truth to power or doing things in periods of tension, all of that is given extra weight by the actual situation going on around the play. Meanwhile, Sonia, our main character, is sort of, we have a lot about her relationships and about various sorts of things about who she is, and particularly this kind of idea of being, you know, in her case, sort of a Palestinian woman in London, and so this kind of disjointedness sometimes of, you know, coming back to Palestine to be part of this play, and therefore feeling like an outsider, but also like she's home. But then also it kind of, it throws into sharp relief so many of these questions around politics and power and various other things. There are some really arresting scenes in this book, including at one point, quite early on, a sort of a passport check or passport control or border control, and she is sort of horrified to realize that the person who is stopping her is British. And she sort of has this odd moment of wanting to feel a kinship with him as a fellow Brit, but also knowing that that being sort of Israeli and Palestinian puts them also on opposite ends of this discussion somewhere else. So she is almost appealing to his sort of a kind of common shared sort of kinfolk idea of him being British, but that kind of stops as soon as the kind of other politics kind of engage around it. So she has this sort of really complicated history around it, and it's just so interesting, I think, to see how she navigates this. Both Sonia the character and Isabella Hammad the author kind of approach these sorts of tensions throughout the book, and I think the way this book builds towards an ending I found just utterly captivating. I thought it was so well observed and so well done at the end of this book. And yeah, I really, really loved it. Next up, we have Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. And again, I've spoken about this book so many times. I adore this book. I think it's fantastic. It's a book that largely focuses on I was about to call her a single mother. She's not, technically, but she feels very much like a single mother throughout the book. She is raising her son, and all the way through the book, she has this odd feeling of feeling kind of quite isolated. There's a lot in here about the mental load and about sort of almost an emotional and physical sort of distance that she feels from her husband, that she is raising their child, and she's not getting much back from him. So often, you know, she finds herself being caught up in the kind of day-to-day of laundry and preparing food and making sure that he's safe and well fed and making sure he's clean and all these sorts of things. And she goes through all of this daily. We sort of get this inner monologue of hers, of this kind of constant beating drum of something that she's got to do next. And she starts to feel a strong sense of resentment towards her partner, who she doesn't feel is doing as much, or at least doesn't seem to be as affected by things as well. And this kind of comes into that wider idea of the mental load of, you know, him perhaps not noticing something, you know, an old t-shirt on the floor, and she has to go and pick it up, and she has to go and do this, and it just builds and builds. But I think what's particularly great about this book is just the level of observation of the small inner moments that she feels of just wanting somebody to look at her and see the work she's doing. At one point, she sort of makes friends and almost is so desperate for adult conversation, but is also feeling really unequipped to be able to do that anymore, because she just doesn't understand. She's finding it really hard to understand how to do that, because her life is this child and living in the moments between all of the tasks that need to get done. So I found it really interesting. I think it's so well done. It's very funny in places as well. It's, I think, incredibly biting and clever and sarcastic, and I just loved it. I think this is such a beautiful novel. It was one of my favourite books of last year, and I just think it's so well done. This is my personal favourite for the winner, in case it hadn't been already obvious from this. But I just love this book so much. And last but not least, we have River East, River West by Aube Lescure. I mean, this is a debut, and she, I think, writes her socks off in this book. It's really interesting. It's particularly focused on Shanghai. And in Shanghai, the two parts of the city divided by the river are River East, River West, and at least when translated into English, that's Puxi, Pudong is how they're that's what they look like translated. And but it also focuses on these other ideas of East versus West in a wider global sense, because we sort of have a reverse immigration story in some ways, or kind of expat story. We have somebody who's moving from the US to China, and in some ways that is the reverse of the travels that people around her have been having. And as a result, it's her kind of struggling to adjust to this life. But equally, within all of that, she does some there are also wider conversations. So at one point, North Korea is mentioned, and a town called Dandong in China, which I've been to, which is kind of interesting to see these places appear. It's kind of fun. But Dandong is right on the border with North Korea, and so again, there's a reference that she mentioned in a talk I went to about how depending on where you stand in, you know, North Korea or in China, the river is to the east of you or to the west of you. And so there are all these other little moments sort of peppered through it like that as well. But what I think is particularly clever and interesting about this book is the way that it kind of is this big moving story about kind of, you know, the sort of secrets and loss and all these things we keep hidden and all of those sorts of things. But really as well at the heart of it, it deals so much with that idea of how you fit between different cultures. You know, she can adopt all these mannerisms of something, or she can learn the language, or she can do whatever. And maybe one place will consider her a full version of that place and the other one might not. But actually, no matter where she goes, she's sort of caught in between these two places. She's never quite at home in either. And so I think there's something quite interesting about the way this book approaches that I just found really, yeah, really captivating. I thought it was just a very clever and well-observed book. There's also just a very moving story at the heart of it as well. And so those are the 6 books. As you can tell, I think there are a lot of really solid books on this list. I think it's a very, very good list. I have some personal favourites. I think, like I mentioned, Claire Kilroy's Soldier Sailor, I still think it's a book I absolutely adored. I think about it a lot. It's a very, very clever and beautiful book. I also really love Enter Ghost by Isabella Hammad, and I also really loved Anne Enright's The Wren. Those are the 3 like 5-star rated books for me. But I think, you know, as I mentioned, where is it? Brotherless Night, I think is also just a really well-told book. I think it's had such a good reception for good reason. It's a really beautiful book. It tells that story so meaningfully and so poignantly. And I just think it's yeah, again, it's very beautifully told. It really focuses on the difficulties that can come with that sort of softness and brutality living side by side on a daily basis. I think River East, River West is also just a really solid book. And again, although I have my own issues with Restless, Dolly, Maunder, I still think it's a solid book. It's just not my kind of thing. So actually, I think, you know, with both the non-fiction shortlist this year and the fiction shortlist this year, both of them I think are absolutely like chock full of incredible books. So I'm excited to see what happens with the winner, because really any of these, and obviously it's a cliche to say any could win because they're shortlisted, so of course there is a chance. But genuinely, all of them appeal in so many different ways, I think. And I'd love to see what comes up. Obviously, I've got my personal favourites. Predictions, I think, is a fool's errand on this. But I do think the winner will be... I'm torn. I think the winner will be between Soldier Sailor, Brotherless Night, and Enter Ghost. And I don't really have any rhyme or reason for why. I just think I think these are really big universal stories that focus on the inner lives of people in such interesting ways. All of them do, but I think there's a really beautiful focus in those books that I think would make them really solid winners. But I think all of these would be very, very good winners. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Who are you rooting for? What books have you read or enjoyed? Yeah, I hope you like them. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.